Hello and welcome to Homegrown Hangout. I'm your host, Homegrown, and today we have a special debate episode. I have capital gains on, and today we are going to be discussing the labor theory of value. Capital gains, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, my show name is Capital Gains. My real name is Aaron. And of course, big surprise, I am an anarcho capitalist. And I am looking forward to having another discussion with homegrown syndicalist. Yeah.
All right, so where do we begin? I would like to start with definitions. Well, before I
Hmm.
want to start with definitions, I want to say that last time I had you on, I have a nasty habit of interrupting. And when I when I watched through the video, I noticed that you were good about it, but I interrupted you a lot. So now I have a pad of paper. So I might start furiously scribbling, and that's what I'm going to be doing instead of interrupting you now.
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
So, all right, to begin, I want to. I know that there's a lot of misconceptions on what the labor theory of value actually is. And I feel like most arguments against it don't actually address the arguments that it actually presents. It strawmans it into claiming that it makes other arguments that it doesn't. So
Hmm.
I want to hear what your understanding about the labor theory of value is. What is it and what does it say in your words or in your ideas?
Sure, I'd be happy to give my attempt at defining it. But to do that, first I want to start off by saying that I've read and observed slightly different definitions of it or slightly different interpretations of it from different Marxists and different kinds of socialists and communists. Not to mention also, of course, from the capitalists as well. Boy, do they have a bunch of divergent definitions of it. But the gist that I understand is that you've got value and price, and the value of a given object or good or service is going to be determined or proportional to the amount of labor that is put into the creation of that good or service. I want to go further to say that I've found what I think is a little bit of an internal inconsistency among some definitions of the labor theory of value, because on the one hand you've got writings from Karl Marx that say, the hours of labor or the quantity of labor, represented by time, is the only determining factor in the value of a good or service. It's the only thing that can be measured. That's what Marx said. But then on the other hand, he says, well. Price can go up and down, it can fluctuate, and value is in the eye of the beholder, and so on. But most of the time I'm seeing people say that labor, either labor in terms of effort or in terms of time, that's how you would quantify the amount of labor that goes into a good or service, and then that alone is how the good or service becomes valuable to the consumer. And there's consequences uh, for this logical chain. There's consequences in terms of exploitation and extraction of surplus value, and so on. So what do you think of
Okay.
that?
All right. So I you're about where I expected you to be. You're a bit more gracious and understanding than a lot of people, I would say. So I want to start off with sort of the history of the labor theory of value. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people don't notice, but Adam Smith, the foundational writer of capitalism, was one of the first people to sort of define a labor theory of value. And in that sense, in that time, it was in opposition to what was the not the subjective theory of value, but the utilitarian theory of value. So in the day, the two alternating theories of value, or still are, is the idea that something's value is the utility that one can get from it. And generally, in at least in economics courses that I took, that's what the capitalist theory of value is about. Subjective is more about price. And so the two values, that's the labor, the side that the value being what goes into it, versus the utilitarian, the value is what you can get out of it. And it's two different views. And I would say that subjective is kind of the synthesis of the two, that it's not
Hmm.
necessarily a subjective theory of value versus labor theory of value. It's more of different ways of viewing value and different perspectives that can kind of work in tandem. So my one of my biggest issues with the opponents of labor, the labor theory of value, is the idea that it determines price or measurement. In my eyes, the labor theory of value is not about measurement. It's not about measuring how valuable something is. It's determining where the value came from. That's the distinction I use.
I
And
gotcha.
that the traditional Marxian definition of the labor theory of value, mine is a little bit different, but Marx said that the value of a commodity, not anything, the value of a commodity is created or derives from the labor that created that commodity. I generally agree with that. I would add to it a thing about, what is it? Raw materials, that you talk about things having value from the labor that goes into it. And people bring up raw materials saying, oh, no labor goes into the water. So is water worthless? And no, water isn't worthless, but water in a river is not a commodity. You can't just go to a market and get the water that's in the river. It has to be gotten to you. Someone either has to put pipes in to get it to your house, or someone has to bottle it to get it to you. And it is the labor that goes into transporting or getting the raw material from its natural state into the commodity form. That is the value that I consider you to be paying for when you purchase a quote unquote raw material. So that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of my the basics of the labor theory of value in my
Hmm.
view.
Yeah, that sounds pretty fair. One thing that I found interesting that you said is that you believe that the subjective and labor value theories aren't necessarily in direct opposition, but can have a complementary aspect, at least to some degree. There, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Hmm. So here's a quick question for you, man. If there is somewhat, and I'm not sure, honestly, I'm not sure if I agree that there is a complementary aspect to them. I feel like one would dilute the other. The more you try and mix them, they might. But here's my question for you: is if there's a bit of a complementary aspect or a synergy between the subjective labor theory or the subjective value theory versus the labor value theory, do you feel that? Do you feel that that opens the door for workers to work on things that they don't own, or own things that they don't work on, and it doesn't count as some sort of immoral exploitation? If there's going to be a room for the subjective value theory to get its foot in the door, then is there room here for absentee landlordism or wage labor and so on being morally acceptable?
Well, so that's a good question.
Thank you.
So, so I don't consider it to be that allowing for the subjective theory, or not necessarily the subjective theory, that allowing for subjectivity will
Mm,
inevitably lead to landlordism and absentee ownership. And
mm,
you're worried about people being banned from, or not allowed to contribute to something that they don't own. That's kind like, I get why you say that, but that's kind of the opposite perspective I have. I'm
mm.
worried about people being manipulated into positions where they quote unquote willingly sign up for an enterprise that's taking advantage of them without them knowing it. And I think that
Mm.
that type of arrangement is absolutely proliferated our modern economy, and our laws do absolutely nothing to prevent against it, and our modern conception of value doesn't view it that way. And so the labor theory of value kind of has a different perspective that says that, hey, it's the work that goes into things that makes those things valuable, not just what you can get out of things.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. So if you think that if you said you're not necessarily worried about people working on things they don't own or owning things they don't work on a priori, but you're more concerned about the possibility of a worker being bamboozled or tricked or having a misrepresentation presented to them where they're fooled into contributing their labor in some way into a system or enterprise that's cheating them, that's doing some sort of fraudulent activity or
Absolutely.
so as a capitalist, as a defender of the subjective value theory and a capitalist, I would say that I definitely I was like, hey man, we shouldn't agree so much, but I agree with
Right.
you that it's bad to, misrepresent your position to a worker or cheat them or swindle them out of some sort of agreed upon compensation in exchange for the labor that they present. But if you're worried about nefarious activity or misrepresentation or racketeering or some sort of lie or fraud, then I would say that absolutely there are multiple there's a lot of situations where wage labor and absentee landlordism or working on things you don't own or owning things you don't work on can happen on the up and up, where fraud or lying does not come into play. So there should be so what I'm saying is that a priori wage labor in itself isn't going to necessarily be immoral as a fundamental as a fundamental property of the wage labor concept itself, right? So there should be room here for people just working at someone else's factory in exchange for an upfront payment. That should be an option. It shouldn't, obviously it shouldn't be like some sort of mandatory thing, but it should be considered a morally justifiable option in terms of labor arrangements, right?
Okay. All right. So you said something at the end, which I think touches upon a lot of the uh, miscommunication, that you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about how it should be okay for someone to work on someone else's property. And my my understanding or my view is that it's sort of a slippery slope, that when you
Mm-hmm.
talk about quote unquote my property, that it's very easily is like, say, just a family business, like a couple of workers, it's a mom and pop. And under that arrangement, I would say that I would like for maybe some basic level of workplace democracy, that maybe the mom and pops that did all the work that started it, they start out with 2 votes or 3 votes each, and then each additional worker has one. But then as they continue to work at the enterprise, eventually over time, I would say that the labor of the workers catch, or the contribution that the workers made to the enterprise with their labor catches up to the initial contribution that the owners made with the creation of it. I would say that those two contributions catch up, and that ultimately democratization is good. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and then that goes to the very other end of the scale, where you're looking at massive corporations. And that, in those situations, when you're talking about it should be okay to work at quote unquote someone else's property, in this instance, that someone else is essentially a king, and a king with dictatorial rule over the enterprise that he owns. And it's his
Yeah.
property, so it's okay that he owns it. And I know that we in the Enlightenment, we kind of decided collectively that democracy was a good thing, and the people having a say and having a say over the decisions that affect them is a good thing. That
Mm-hmm.
that does not, or that has not really carried over to the workplace.
Hmm. So, size and scale are a factor here when it comes to how you. Let me start over. Your perception of how legitimate the private ownership of a given enterprise is, and the relation between the owners and the wage laborers, that justifiability of that enterprise existing in that form is going to be somewhat dependent on the size or scale. So as an example, a mom and pop flower shop with maybe 10 employees and 2 owners, the mom and pop owners and 10 employees, that might be less objectionable in your eyes than, say, the Amazon.com with 50,000 employees and Bezos as a king at the top.
Absolutely. Well, sorry to interrupt. In the short term, absolutely. But I would say that mom and pops are less objectionable than large scale enterprises in almost every manner. I would like some not immediate, but some long term, over time transition of power from just a minority of workers at the enterprise to the mass of the workers at the enterprise. That the mom and pop have 10 employees and they're just 2. And it's 2 people having the dictatorial say over 10. And that it makes sense in the beginning that they put in all the effort in the beginning, but over time, I would like to see them gradually transfer the power over to the workers.
This kind of reminds me of a similar point that you touched on last time we debated, where it seems like what you're saying here is like some sort of wage labor in perpetuity is more objectionable to you than a situation where someone starts as a wage laborer, and as they continue to contribute to the enterprise and provide value to the enterprise, that the ownership gradually transfers over from the owner to the worker, because the worker's like paying off a loan in a sense. There's like a fixed amount that the worker, like the worker pays off the factory machine over time, like the way I pay off a car loan or something like that, as opposed to leasing a car. You know what I mean? The difference I'm getting at there. Is that the kind of distinction you're trying to make? Just so I understand.
Actually, absolutely. So, Max Stirner talks about. So, I want to touch on Max Stirner a sec because he wrote a great book called "The Unique in Its Property," or most commonly, the Ego in His Own. It's in German and it's a weird translation, but he has a distinct definition of property. I don't have the same definition of him, but I like how he starts with how he defines property. Stirner defines property as some something that you interact with becomes your property. Stirner's weird. Stirner's actually a advocate of theft, and that in seizing something and making it your own, it does become your own. I don't have the quite the same sense, but my view of property is similar to that of a mutualist. It's use based. I think that in using something, and that your use of something, your contribution to something has meaning, and it is that meaning is analogous to property ownership, or to make it your property, and that the more you contribute to something, the more you work on it, the more it becomes your property. If you, let's say, or let's use a sort of hyperbolic example. Let's say you have an owner who owns some tools,
Yeah.
and he owns them nominally, but he's never touched them. He has an employee who uses those tools, and with those tools, he is productive. And the owner gets a percentage of the productive value that's generated with the tools,
Yeah.
but that is generated by the labor. And over time, I would say that as the worker is productive with those tools, if they become his property, he uses them, they become his by his use.
So I think I understand that example. Let me give you a counterpoint here. See, what I think the problem is that you're running yourself into when you present that kind of scenario, that someone has to eventually achieve ownership of the tools by laboring with those tools, even though the tools were initially purchased or obtained by some owner who never actually labors with the tools. Here's the thing, is that you have to make a special pleading case where you say, okay, what I just said about the worker getting the tools only applies to means of production, and that's where the personal versus private property distinction has to come up. And let me tell you why. Let's say that you are a wage laborer yourself, and you work, and over time you save up a couple $100,000, and then you buy a house. You bought a house with your money. You did not build that house. Someone else built the house and sold it to you for money. And then what you do, now that you are the homeowner and you live in that house, then what you do is you use your money to pay someone else to maintain the house for you. Now, let's say you live in the house, but you've never mowed the lawn in your life. You never fixed your clogged sink in your life. You never vacuumed your carpet in your life. You always pay someone else to vacuum your carpet, to mow your lawn, and to unplug your sink. How long before that person you're paying to do those chores for you, how long until they own your house? You know what I mean? And when they do $300,000, when they do the asking price that you paid for your house, when they do that much labor, do they own your house now? When they achieve that total amount of contributed labor over time? Or, you see, so I think you have to like make an exception to your own rule, and you say, okay, so this whole thing about the tools, the tool man, eventually owning the tools, that only applies to when you're making a profit. If it's like a house or something that you're not making a profit, then this whole rule doesn't apply. And then when it comes to my house, the person doing the chores can just do that in perpetuity, and he never becomes ownership of the house. So you're making this special pleading thing, and you're like, you're refuting your own argument depending on whether or not a piece of property makes widgets or not. And I think that kind of shows an internal contradiction, and I think it proves the lie to the idea of the tool man having to automatically, own the tools.
So
Anyway.
I think the issue I see here is that you are seemingly correctly identifying the difference between personal and private property, but are claiming that uh, the distinction of that distincting between private and personal property, that the fact that someone can make that distinction, you seem to say that that's special pleading or that's hypocritical. And I don't see anything hypocritical with saying that, yes, property that creates a profit is fundamentally different than property that doesn't create a profit. And property that creates a profit should be treated differently than property that doesn't create a profit. That property that creates a profit is the means of production. This is private property. And I think that it should be owned and controlled by the person who is productive with it. And private property or personal property is the property that you own, you use, it's your personal, it's your house, it's your domicile. Then you brought up the idea of someone who doesn't do any of the maintenance on their own house. And I like that example. That's a fantastic example. I
Thank
would
you.
like to take it to its logical conclusion, that of the palace of a wealthy person or a mansion of a wealthy person with live-in servants, and that those servants are the ones who do all of the work to maintain the house. They even live in the house, yet they do not own the house. They have
Mm-hmm.
no say over the house. The family that they serve has all of the say, and I would be opposed to that hierarchy. I would say
Mm.
that the servants who do all of the work to maintain the lavish house should have some level of say, some level of autonomy over that lavish house. I would personally like for the family and the servants to integrate, become one community of equals who all of which contribute labor to the house and the maintaining of its enterprises, and all live in it as one community. So that's kind of
Mm.
my view on that.
I got you. So let me ask you this then. If you let's go back to my example about the not the palace. I want to touch on your
Right.
palace one in just a moment. What I
Yeah.
want to do is I want to make a distinction between the palace and and the regular like $300,000 two
Oh,
bedroom, you know what I mean?
absolutely.
So imagine, first off, you got the one example where there's a $300,000 house. It's a 2 or 3 bedroom. Let's say that you live in it, you and you alone live in it, and you pay one handyman to do all the chores. Now, I'm presuming here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm presuming that in that particular kind of example, you're okay with the handyman doing labor on the house for a wage in perpetuity and never ever acquiring ownership of the house, even if the handyman eventually contributes more than $300,000 worth of labor to the house over time. But then in the palace, now a palace is not a means of production. I would argue the palace is not a means of production. I'm assuming that you would agree there. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say you got a palace that's got 40 bedrooms. The family in it, owns the palace, and then you've got maybe 20 servants, right? Some just like ridiculous, example here. 20 servants, not a single one of those 20 servants owns the house, or the palace. But let's say the palace is worth, $10 million. Is there a point when the 20 servants collectively contribute more than $10 million worth of labor to that palace that you believe now they should own the palace, even though the palace is not a means of production? And if so, then why do you feel like the previous example with the $300,000 house and the single handyman, why is he exempt from that rule that you apply to the palace and the factory?
Okay,
Like
all right.
how do you make that distinction and exemption,
Okay, so the idea of the palace is honestly not one that I have thought through to the extent to which I feel comfortable backing it up. It's just something I thought of when you mentioned the handyman. The
But
issue, so
so you see how
I
the
have no
exemption comes
no,
in, right?
I understand. The thing about the handyman is that I don't have an issue with him. It's not him that I really have the issue with. I do have an issue with people who live such extravagant lives that they are incapable of maintaining their own property, that they are incapable of unclogging a toilet, of fixing a sink, of doing anything. I would prefer that people are capable or only live in domiciles that they are actually capable of maintaining. And
Mm-hmm.
that as a domicile becomes more and more extravagant to the point where you are no longer able to maintain it on your own, that is kind of the sliding scale where I see it transitioning from personal to private, in that it's with the when it slides into the palace, the people who do the labor of maintaining it transfer almost entirely from the owners to the workers. And that shift of control over the ownerships, that those there's a difference between an independent handyman who contracts out to a bunch of houses. I'm more okay with that than, oh, this is our live-in handyman and he fixes all of our pipes and he sleeps under the stairs
Yeah.
and we pay him in the fact that he lives here and we give him a little stipend on top of that. Once I would say that that handyman on working on those same pipes over and over and over every day, that's how the ownership would transfer over to him.
Hmm. So it seems that the line, the differentiation that you're drawing isn't so much based on whether or not a property is a means of production, but more about how extravagant or how big or how valuable it is, what the sticker price was, or I mean, like it seems like a handyman working on the 3-bedroom modest house is not objectionable to you, just like the means of production that's a mom and pop shop is not objectionable to you. It seems that your objection arises more when the grandiosity gets really big and obvious. It seems that the objection comes up more when the palace is too big and fancy, or when the factory is too big, or when the CEO makes too much money, something like that. So it seems more like on a scale or envy kind of thing. You're more concerned about the inequality, the scale of the inequality, rather than the innate a priori, fundamentals of these scenarios themselves, right? It's like a
Okay.
special pleading kind of thing. It's a logical fallacy, is what I think I see.
So I get what you're saying. It's not necessarily the grandiosity, the opulence. The thing that I am most focused on is who works on it.
Mm-hmm.
I like when people work on the things that they own. It's theirs, they work on it, they contribute to it. Perfect. My issue is when people work with what they do not own. That a handyman going to lots of different homes, it's his tools, his specific tools in his toolbox. That is what he works on. And he works on a great many number of pipes. And
Yeah.
he contributes very little to every single one of those pipes. So I would say that he does not have an ownership claim over those many pipes. However, if he is in a single house and working on the same pipes over and over, that's when the contribution builds up. And that it's not about the grandiosity, it's about the labor and who provides the maintenance labor towards an enterprise or towards a piece of property.
Uh, Let me think here. How to bring this in? How to tie this into the labor theory of value? Because I like when we're having this back and forth, but we're getting a little bit more into the
Sure,
ownership
yeah.
thing. So, well, let me ask you this though. We both went back and forth a bit on the worker grandiosity versus whether it's a means of production, how much the worker's contributing. The labor theory of value. Tell me this because one question that kept popping up in my mind when I was reading about the subjective theory and the labor theory and utilitarian theory and marginal theory. How do you see the labor theory of value justifying or giving weight to the argument that the worker should own the means of production, and if you don't work on a means of production you should not own it? You know what I mean? Like how does
Okay.
the labor theory really bring that consequence, bring the weight into that claim in your
Okay,
eyes?
I think all right. I think the consequence of the labor theory of value justifying worker ownership of the means production is very similar to the theory of self determination necessarily leading to personal ownership and the ideas against slavery. That in the labor theory of value, the idea that it is your labor that it is that is valuable and that you contribute value via your labor shows that when you are not compensated or have not the say over your labor, that there is a contradiction of interests, and that for train of thought for a sec, that um I'm sorry, what
How does the labor?
I
Are
just
you okay?
I just
You're
had a brain fart. Can you restate the question?
sure. Let me try and simplify. I tend to get wordy. How in your mind does the labor
Oh
theory of
yeah.
value give weight to the claim that a worker, morally speaking, should own the means of production, and that if you don't work on something, that you should
Right,
not be
right,
allowed to
right.
own it?
Okay, I remember where my brain fart was going. So the idea that you should own your own labor is, I feel, analogous to the argument that you should own your own body. And that I believe
I
that
like that.
over time that the labor theory of value is analogous to a an argument or the idea of individuality or personal freedom, that individuals should be free to self-determine, but not just self-determine, that they should be free to do with their labor and control it as they would like to. That unfortunately, we do have nominal free will to choose who to sell our soul, sell our labor to, but we do not necessarily have the same freedom to control our labor. And that I would say it that, yeah, so in short, that the idea of self-determination being an argument against slavery is analogous to labor theory of value being an argument against exploitation and wage labor.
Interesting. I actually, I promised myself I would try to agree with you less this time around, but once again, I find myself, and I'm very sorry to the audience, I kind of agree with you here on one particular point in your argument, but then there's another part I disagree with. So let me,
Sure.
I like the part how you try to use self-determination and self-ownership to justify the logic behind the labor theory of value, because as an anarcho-capitalist, I am a huge fan of self-determination and self-ownership. Now, my experience arguing with most of people on the economic left is that most of them tend to not really be fans of self-ownership, the phrase at least self-ownership, but I will say that, people on the left definitely say, hey, workers should own their labor, but they usually go, oh, you don't own yourself, self-ownership is nonsense. But it seems to me like you recognize, and I believe this is correct, you recognize that self-ownership is how ownership of one's own labor and self-determination of how one disposes of one's labor, that's how it gets justified through the self-ownership principle. But
absolutely.
Good.
Right.
That sounds great.
Disagree. Okay.
So now here comes the part where I disagree. But
Perfect.
I believe that the self-ownership concept doesn't, I don't see how it justifies the labor theory of value, or rather, I don't see how self-ownership justifies a prohibition on wage labor, or at least, if not a prohibition, if you don't want wage labor straight outlawed, then I would say I don't see how self-ownership justifies a moral condemnation of wage labor, or how it justifies at least a distaste for wage labor. I could see, but on the other hand, I would say, look, self-determination and ownership of one's own labor doesn't, it neither endorses nor condemns wage labor, just like it neither endorses or condemns worker ownership of the means of production. How I interpret the concept of self-determination is that it necessarily allows for either of those things to happen. It allows for the worker to choose whether he wants to own the means of production, or whether he wants to not own the means of production and contribute to something he doesn't own. I feel like both of those should be permissible, and as an anarcho-capitalist, I feel like there's room, at least in Ancapistan, right? In the utopia of Ancapistan, there should be room for worker-owned co-ops and privately owned enterprises that employ wage labor. I feel like both are morally acceptable from the capitalist perspective and from the self-determination perspective. So do you want to go into some detail of how you interpret self-determination to kind of necessitate or only give justification to the LTV?
So I think that one of the issues with true self-determination is that it doesn't really take into account the fallibility of people and our ability to choose things that go against our self-interest. I would say that you talk about not wanting like a prohibition on private property, and I understand why you are uh afraid of that. Like that's the big commies are taking away your toothbrush. No, that's not what it's necessarily about. It's the problem is what is meant by a prohibition. I've talked before about my desire to, instead of outright ban private property, more to make it obsolete.
Yeah, sorry.
The question comes, what does that mean? And personally, in my eyes, I view it as a sort of planned obsolescence, that the workers plan it, and that if all of the workers collectively plan to make it obsolete, then it becomes obsolete. Now, there are some people who would call that someone coming in and banning something and making it not allowed, but it's a very fine line between, like, yes, the Civil War banned slavery, but we decided that the big government coming in and banning slavery was okay because slavery is abhorrent. And who's to say that after we ban private property that we don't decide that, yeah, it was abhorrent, so it was good that we banned it, and that the difference between an obsolescence, a planned obsolescence, and the state banning it, it is not, it's a sliding scale. I am more in favor of the ground up version of it, of the workers deciding we're not going to work for private enterprises, instead of the utilization of a state to come in from the top and say you're not going to do that anymore. I would prefer the workers from the bottom to say, hey, we're not going to take it anymore.
Mm-hmm. I gotcha. I appreciate that distinction. Now, the thing is that I talked to a bunch of different leftists, both of the more authoritarian big government side, and then also of the more anarchist side. You know, more along your lines, and not always, but sometimes the anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, and socialists will say, "Look, we don't want some blanket ban enforced under threat of gulag for against private property. We want to see it be made obsolete. We want to see it go the way of the dodo. We want to see society just voluntarily evolve beyond it." And when I get that reply, I appreciate that reply, but it makes me kind of chuckle, because what I see is like it seems like at this point you and I want to see the same stage set, the same stage laid out, but we're just like predicting different that the actors on the stage will act differently. Like, it's like, okay, well, if neither one of us want to ban private property, I just think private property is cool and you think it's distasteful and it should just be made obsolete, then we're just making predictions on what, we're placing our bets on where we think the ball is going to land, but the roulette table is the same for both of us. Oh my gosh, do you hear this?
Well, I do hear
I got a
I
baby
think it's
screaming and banging on the door. I'm sorry, everyone.
all right.
I predict that capitalism, that private property, that wage labor, these things will continue to be popular, at least nominally. I don't necessarily see them remaining dominant or whatever. Maybe the workers will want to own the means of production more. Maybe it'll be a 50-50 thing, but I really don't see it becoming, I don't see the wage labor thing becoming obsolete or becoming extinct just voluntarily. I believe there's definitely room for it. I think the historical record shows that the less government prohibitions you have, generally speaking, the more private property and wage labor, instances you'll see happening. And even when governments, even when prohibitions do try and get enforced on wage labor or private property, you'll see black markets arise, and you'll see that stuff happen illegally despite the prohibitions. So, in terms of us, having a in terms of us having a wage labor question, like which way are they going to go? Are they going to zig or zag? We don't really know, but I think it's not too realistic to predict that all the wage laborers are going to universally just agree to make private property obsolete. Even if it does become less popular over time in an anarchist society.
Well, that's sort of the uh, question of how do we increase class consciousness in the working class, which is like the age old question of leftism.
Class
The idea
consciousness,
that
yeah.
right, the idea that we are sort of, that the ANCAPs and the NCOMs are sort of on a similar team, but just waiting to see how the chips fall. I kind of
Yeah.
I sort of under like I agree nominally with that, except for in that uh we, in addition to like seeing how the chips fall, it's important to be one of the actors and to say the to enforce and to exert your will to make the chips fall in a better way. And the that sort of event, in order to abolish the state, it would be a revolution. See, when leftists talk about the revolution, I'm sure it's not something that you are generally in favor of, but I've seen the people on the right talk about a boogaloo, and I would consider a boogaloo to be fairly similar to the leftist idea of a revolution, of
Yeah.
a change of the status quo. Personally, my version of a revolution is less violent. It's not like a war or a civil war or anything of the sort. It is more of a general strike where all of a sudden the workers lock all of the bosses out of the property and say, we're going to work here and you're not going to control us anymore, and that the workers in control of the enterprises will be able to enforce it. But ultimately that does require the workers to want to do this, and that's where I come in. I'm trying to convince as many workers as I can to be nominally in favor of a revolution in the status quo and a change of the layout of society. The ANCAP version is kind of like the state goes away, is more of my
You sell
understanding.
it off to private parties, or just let go bankrupt the portions of the state that wouldn't normally be done by the private sector. So, like, for example, our version of, well, yeah, it depends. I'm sure there's a lot of different ANCAPs that are more pro boogaloo and more pro gun, like storming the Capitol kind of thing in your buffalo vest or whatever. But my version of it would be where the state gradually withers away. And for example, like, you privatize Amtrak, you privatize the postal service, but then the military industrial complex would go bankrupt, and the assets would be sold off for scrap. You see, so like the portions of the government that the market entities would support because there's a demand for that service among the consuming public, those things would be privatized, and then the ones that consumers don't want, like drone strikes, those would just cease to happen. You know what I mean? So that would be my interpretation of a capitalist revolution.
Right. So my big issue with sort of anarcho-capitalism is what I consider to be the neo-feudalist argument. It's sort of the idea that if
Mm.
we are to say, if the government goes away, it sells off all of its assets, and everything becomes private property, and private owners end up having control over all sectors of the country, then those private enterprises that all of a sudden Amazon or Walmart like are going to have all of a sudden the greatest amount of power and influence. It used to be the state at least kept up appearances of keeping the corporations in check, even though I would say that the state is a puppet of the corporations, and the military industrial complex is a vicious rotting cycle propping itself up, and that the capitalists at the top don't want the state to go away. They want the state to be where it is to give them all of the power. And so, since they have all the power and influence, they're not gonna. But in the event, if say the state were to disappear, then those capitalist entities would no longer have a puppet that is pretending to keep them in check. There are no more laws to stop them from doing whatever it is they want. I don't think the non-aggression policy is going to be strong enough to stop Jeff Bezos from violently conquering the Pacific Northwest and setting up the kingdom of Amazonia.
And have Amazon.com police. Jesus. Yeah. Okay. So that's always like what's the phrase of, what's the name that they call that argument where the evil tyranny guy
Strawman?
comes by and
Yeah.
privatizes everything and subjugates the entire planet, right? Like Bezos style. Let me give you a counter example. Having workplaces democratized, if every means of production ends up without fail being collectively owned by the workers within each of those enterprises, and then they're all run democratically, I don't think that makes them any less likely to become a tyranny than if Amazon.com was privately owned. You know what I mean? Like democracies
Well,
can vote for really bad things, and
well, sure, Oh, I'm sorry. I'll let you go.
no, go ahead. I'm done. The democracies can vote for
Okay.
really bad things. They can be just as evil as an individual human, right?
Yeah, so this is kind of the tyranny of the majority argument, that it's possible
Yeah.
for the majority to still vote for a bad thing. And my argument is that the enterprises, the bad things that those enterprises were doing, were bad to its workers, and that those workers then having a vote are going to vote for things that are no longer bad for them. That the you talk or people bring up the problem of the tyranny of the majority, that the majority will rule and that the minority will not have a say. Well, that is a problem, but arguably worse than tyranny of the majority is tyranny of a minority. That I would much
Yeah.
prefer a majority to have the say over an enterprise or over the whole than a minority. Because right now we live in a society where, like, both the Republican and the Democratic Party, like, there's gerrymandering and all of these things that are in the way to make it so whatever party is in power holds on to their power even if the vote didn't go their way. They've broken up the districts so actually they get more seats in Congress than the proportional of voters or whatever it's going on. So my problem happens when those who have power try to use it to stifle and oppress others.
You know, and I liked your response about how it's better to have a tyranny of 51% of the people than a tyranny based on 1/10 of 1% of the people, right? So
Yeah.
so yeah. Now I see that point, and it's like, look, if you're gonna subjugate, if people are gonna be subjugated, then it's better to subjugate only 49% of the population than 99% of the population. At least I get that point. But here's where I think I have a solution to that problem, both from the Bezos tyrant and the tyranny of the majority, and that is the free market and competition. If you have on the macro scale a competitive free market and a fluctuating price and consumer choice, if a consumer can choose from 10 different cars made by 10 different separate competing worker co-ops, then the tyranny of those co-ops will be kept in check by consumer choice. And on the same token, if you have 10 different privately owned car companies with 10 different tyrants at the head of each car company in a competitive market, the tyrants in those 10 car companies are likewise going to be kept in check by consumer choice. So and this is one of the things, I like to trash talk democracy, but the truth is I do not have a problem morally or not even really business economic wise with democracy on a micro scale, where democracy is contained within each individual enterprise, because what I see in that situation is a macro competitive market, and that's my game. My big jam is competition and consumer choice, where I see the most amount of autonomy happening. The most important aspect, the most important instantiation of autonomy for the individual is in consumer choice. More so, I think that's more important than the labor question. I think it's the consuming question, because we don't consume for the sake of production. We produce for the sake of consumption. And the best way to have people's needs and Mets want is to give them the most choice in terms of how they consume. So when you have on a macro scale a free market and competition, then your tyranny of the majority is going to be kept in check. The tyranny of Bezos and Bill Gates is going to be kept in check. Where the tyranny is not kept in check, and I think you and I all agree on this part, is when you have the big government that claims this monopoly, and there is no competition for the government, and the government just says, what I say and where I go, and then that's how the government corrupts democratic processes. And I mean, frankly, in my opinion, government makes democracy look kind of bad. Maybe in my eyes, democracy wouldn't look as bad if you see it more in workplaces and less in a government monopoly. And likewise, government makes sole proprietorships and partnerships and outside investment and all that stuff look bad as well. And then so the capitalist businesses won't look as bad absent the government. So now we're getting into bottom unity again, I guess, even though I wanted to have a fiery debate. But anyway, tell me your thoughts on that.
Cool. So you hearken to the free market, and that it's the free market is what is able to defend against tyrants. My
Yeah.
problem is that I do not think the free market is capable of keeping tyrants in check. I think that the free market creates the tyrants, in that those tyrants are able to use their tyrannical power to wear the glove of the hand of the free market and bend it to their will. That I don't think that just having the market be quote unquote free of petty little kings in charge of their enterprises is a truly free market. I think the only way for a market to be free is if it is a market of co-ops, that without the tyrants at the head of every enterprise, that each co-op has less of a propensity to become a fully grown tyrannical co-op. What happens is that the people in charge of an enterprise become tyrannical, and through their tyranny, it infects the rest of the enterprise. Without having the tyranny in the center of the enterprises, I think that those enterprises have a much lower propensity towards tyranny. But when you have a free market full of top down dictatorships of kings who own the enterprise, and that the enterprise, if it's going to continue under them unless they die or something, that there is no, uh, unless they really screw up, they're going to be running it forever. I don't think that's necessarily free.
Hmm. So you're discounting the power of consumer choice and competition, the power of consumers to choose where their dollars go and what products they consume. I'll tell you this, I don't think I agree with your response there, because in a free market, you're more likely to see enterprises rise and fail and go bankrupt and go out of business because they did not adequately satisfy the wants of the public at large, of basically the consumers. Whereas in a planned economy, the less free market you have, like the more economic planning and less competition and less free market you have, the less likely you are to see businesses fail when they suck. The businesses that suck ass, that make inferior products or have too high of a price, or there's always shortages, and the businesses where the consumers are less satisfied overall with the service and product they receive, those businesses are less likely to fail, less likely to go extinct and get replaced by a better one in a planned economy. Because in a planned economy, you never see someone economically you never see a democracy plan to make some company lose all of its consumers and go bankrupt. What you see that happening in a free market, where the consumers are going to defy whatever plan Bezos had, because if Bezos started sucking at making customers happy, the customers are going to defy his plan and ruin his plan and choose, no, you're going out of business because you suck. The reason Amazon got so big is because its customer service is very strong. But in a planned economy, you're going to have way less protection in terms of consumer choice. You're also going to, in a free market, you've got more autonomy for individuals. They get to choose how their dollars are spent and what they consume and when and how much. And the less of a free market economy you have, the more they are limited in their choices of consumption. You only get one kind of car, you only get one ration booklet, and you're only going to get that one brand of the same product over and over again, because people voted for you to have it. There's less autonomy there. And when you talked earlier about how you're a big fan of individual autonomy, I think it's important for us to recognize not only the worker labor aspect, but the consumer aspect of that. That's very important in terms of how our hard-earned dollars are spent and how our precious time is chosen to be spent on what goods and services we consume. So I would push back and say that a free market is going to be a much bigger check on tyrannical entities, whether it's a sole proprietorship or whether it's a co-op, whether it's democratic or top down. Those things can both be tyrannical, and the more consumer choice that exists, the more those tyrannies are kept in check.
Okay. Are you done? You're done. Okay. So I sorry. So you
My bad.
talk. It's all good. You say that I discount the ability of consumers to make ethical choices, or to make determinations, and
And
to be, or to more to be.
how they choose winners and losers in the economy, right?
So I would say that generally, yeah, I would say that consumers are less concerned about ethical and which company is ethical, and they're more concerned about which is cheapest. They care more about their wallet if they're trying. That most people, if they are trying to save money, if they don't have enough money to make like that sort of informed big decision, that they'll have they will only choose what's cheapest because that's what they can afford. That I sorry, my arm for my microphone just decided to fall off, and I'm
Oh no,
trying
technical difficulties.
technical difference. But yeah, I would say that consumers are not that just because the consumers are more willing to choose one company over another, that the free market does pick winners and it does pick losers. However, I'm not sure that just because it's picked winners or losers, that those people are necessarily the best or the worst at uh, or the best or worst enterprises. I would say that it's better at choosing the most ruthless enterprise, that whichever enterprise is most able to say lower their profits to a point where they can beat out all their competitors and buy them up, whoever is more ruthless, more underhanded, more uh, mean, is better at gaming the system. And I don't think that the free market does pick winners and losers who are the best or worst suited it to work in the free market. I would say that you need to have some sort of even playing field, that the playing field is not even. You need to even the playing field on some level in order for a free market to even be able to come close to making those choices.
You don't think the free market and consumer choice are the main components of an even playing field? You feel like there's something else that makes that playing field even?
No, I would say that they create an uneven playing field, that capitalism is very efficient at creating a minority of people fantastically wealthy and then a fairly large percentage of people incredibly poor. That it does Capitalism does not necessarily even the playing field. I would say that it widens the playing field, and it's government intervention that is trying to keep capitalism from eating itself. And ultimately, in the end, I think eventually it will eat itself, and that the state won't be able to uh, buy it out of its next crisis.
Hmm. I disagree with I think I see what you're saying, but I disagree with your framing of the free market not being an even playing field, and then some sort of intervention being required to even it out. I mean, when I think of a free market and whether or not the playing field is even, let me give you an example. If you have an economy that is a little bit more planned democratically and a little less free market, what you're going to find yourself is the majority votes say for the Toyota to be the only car that they produce this time around, and they don't, if you don't want competition, then everyone votes, and okay, by 51% we choose the Toyota Corolla. Sorry, everyone that likes the Ford Focus, you're not going to get it. And then on the other hand, in a free market, even if only 5% of the consumers like the Ford Focus, the minority 5%, there's still enough demand there for the Ford Motor Company to produce the Ford Focus. So now you've got 5% of people driving a Ford Focus while the other 51% or 95% or whatever are driving their Toyota Corolla. But in this instance, in this example, the rights of the minority were protected because the minority 5% still got what they wanted, and they were not forced to get the Toyota Corolla that the other 95% wanted. I know that seems like a trite example using cars. It was just the first, good that came up
Right.
as an example.
So I feel like you keep harkening back to like a Soviet style command economy, and that is not something that I advocate in favor of. That I favor workplace democracies. However,
But you don't favor you seem to be poo-pooing competition here, so that's kind of why I
well,
shifted
I'm not.
towards the planned
Oh,
economy attack.
so it's all right. It's not that I'm poo-pooing competition. It's that with competition between kings, as the free market currently is not as efficient as a free market between uh, associations of equals could be, and that associations of equals have a better ability to compete ethically than dictatorships are able to.
So do you feel like an economy with worker-owned co-ops? Are you saying that that sort of system will have better, more competition and more real competition, and that you're concerned that capitalism
that
doesn't give enough competition?
Well, my concern is that we do not I remember where my train of thought was, that we do not currently live in a free market, that the free market we live in crashes every 4 to 7 years. And every 4 to 7 years, it goes crawling back to the state, and the state has to bail out all the wealthy people that crashed it every time. And that without the state to bail it out, that I don't think capitalism would be able to support itself. I think it would ultimately collapse. I'm sorry. What was your last question? I think I meandered off and then missed the point.
Oh, I was saying that I was trying to get the angle that you were coming from, because I started to talk shit about planned economics, and you said, "Look, I'm not into that Soviet stuff." And then I said, "Oh, okay. Well, did I misinterpret? Or do you want more competition than the amount of competition that I'm arguing for?"
Okay. I want I want, I guess, a free market. It's that I don't think a market between traditional top-down enterprises is a free market. I would
Mm-hmm.
like to free the market from these types of tyrants.
Hmm. Yeah. So to clarify here, I, um, I don't believe that a free market necessarily has to be a bunch of tyrants running mega corporations. Although I don't feel that big companies that are privately owned by single individuals are something that should be necessarily considered necessarily bad. I definitely believe there's room for worker-owned co-ops, and in fact, worker-owned co-ops already exist today. They're pretty cool. I mean, Mondragon is a very famous example, but those worker-owned co-ops, they compete in a marketplace. They earn profit, and they're viable. But so are private-owned. Privately owned, when I say privately owned, like owned by a single person, enterprises. When it comes to the amount of competition, I feel like if you have an economy where privately owned enterprises are forbidden, and I'm not saying that you want to forbid them. I know that you just want to make them obsolete, but in an economy where they are forbidden, then you've got necessarily less competition, because what you would have in that scenario is you'd have a ban on people buying and selling shares of companies they don't own or what have you. Now, if you don't want to ban people buying and selling shares, but you just want it to become obsolete, that's like someone saying, I mean, to me, that seems kind of capitalist, in the sense that, imagine someone goes, "Oh, well, I personally oppose abortion, but I don't want abortion to be illegal." Well, guess what? You're pro-choice as far as I'm concerned. If you just think abortion is not cool and you don't like it when people do it, but you want it to remain allowed, you don't want to see people thrown in jail for it, you don't want to see doctors persecuted for it, then you're pro-choice as far as I'm concerned. So I feel like if you don't want the Jeff Bezos scenario to be outright prohibited under threat of jail, then you're at least making room for capitalism to happen. You're making room for private property to happen. If you want private property to be made obsolete because you don't like it, I'd say, okay, fine. Let's see if it becomes obsolete. In the meantime, we're going to have Ancapistan, right? Because everything's going to be allowed.
It's not that I just want it to be made obsolete and that I don't want it to be banned. It's more that I could personally go either way. That if there was a large scale movement and a lot of people saying, yes, ban private property, no one allowed, and there was a referendum vote for whether or not our society would ban private property, I would vote in favor of banning it. But I understand that uh, that is, or I kind of see that as my way of contributing towards it being made obsolete. But that's not my ideal way for it to go. But if that's the way it's going to go,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not entirely opposed to letting it go that way, if that sort of makes sense.
I gotcha. I think I get you. So, uh, let me ask you this: if there was a scenario where a vote came up for all the workers in a given society, no matter what entity they work at, right? There's a macro vote that comes up, and the question is, do we ban private property? And you vote yes. How would you expect that ban to be enforced absent a state. Do you feel like the state
So,
would be required to enforce that ban before the state's allowed to wither away and your anarchism can be
well,
achieved?
ultimately, any sort of state intervention, or it that would, if there was to be a vote for the state to come in and ban private property, ah, that might be an agonizing decision, because it would be giving power to the state to come in and disrupt things. And I'm not in favor of giving like authority powers to the state.
It's like the meme where you got the two
Oh,
buttons and you're sweating. You can't pick which
so
one to
yeah,
push.
if a state were to be sort of quote unquote enforcing it, I would prefer that instead of it being there's no private property under penalty of death, I would prefer a more sort of slow burn, that like
Mm,
Germany actually has a fantastic system right now, that there is a law that 49% of corporate boards have to be elected by the workers. That
yeah.
it's not that all enterprises have to become co-ops, but in Germany, there all the boards are just shy of a majority voted in by the workers, and I would like to see us go in that direction, and maybe from there we could do a transition to co-ops. But I would be more in favor of not just the government saying you become a co-op or you get gulagged.
I gotcha. So it seems like in a scenario like that, when you give up the Germany example, let's say that the state initially, here's a scenario, right? So the state initially passes a law that says, okay, the workers have to have at least 49% of the control, or they elect people with 49% control, whatever. And then let's say at that point we want the government to wither away and we want to achieve anarchy. Well, how do we protect the momentum and the phenomenon of the workers having the 49% at least? We don't want it to reduce, we want it to grow, right? So in terms of the workers having more control. So then, earlier on you mentioned class consciousness. It seems to me like, absent a state, the only way to safeguard workers owning the means of production and prevent the capitalist crap from happening would be, universal class consciousness, or at least like very overwhelming class consciousness. And to me, it's like expecting the second coming of Christ. Now, okay. So let me back up.
So
I'm an
this
atheist. So
right.
class consciousness, it's like when everyone wakes up and stops sinning and turns to God, And I mean, that's never going to happen. Let me give you an example of Vietnam is something I was reading about recently. Vietnam kicked out the capitalist American military and achieved a communist revolution, and they started educating everyone on Lenin and Marx and the concept of communism. They collectivized the farms, and then fast forward to 2020. So you fast forward 50 years. You can Google this headline: Vietnamese young adults love capitalism at like a rate of 95% or something like that. Class consciousness was not achieved in Vietnam. They love capitalism over there. They pushed back on the collectivization of their agriculture and their economy. And the collectivization of the agriculture stopped in the 80s or the 90s, and now they have a stock market. Now private property is actually the ownership of private entities is starting to go back on the uptrend in Vietnam, and they're reversing all this initial progress that they made communistic wise. Now, so class consciousness to me seems like a very shaky thing to bet your money on. You know what I mean? It's hard to hit that number on the roulette wheel, because it's like the second coming of Christ, and no one's ever going to erase that consciousness. And historically speaking, a lot of attempts to achieve class consciousness ended up backfiring, and within a generation or two, the capitalism became more popular than before.
Yeah, well, that's kind of goes into Leninism and then basic arguments against Leninism. It's the idea that uh, I will have tankies that say that I'm not a real leftist because the state is necessary in order to enforce the will of the people, and that without the state to enforce the will of the people, then the reactionary capitalist forces will be able to come back and reassert their power. And that's kind of like a classic anarchist, the Marxist Leninist argument is, how do we achieve class consciousness? The Leninist argument being that the party or the people who are already class conscious form a party, and that
The
party
vanguard.
is in yes, the vanguard party becomes in charge of taking over the state and enforcing class consciousness. However, I do not like the idea of an exclusionary vanguard such as
Yeah.
like the Bolsheviks kicking out the Mensheviks. If there were to be, say, a revolutionary vanguard, I would prefer a coalitionary revolution that, say, all of the lefty organizations were to get together and be the vanguard instead of a single organization saying, we are the organization, we're going to take charge of the state, we're going to do everything, and you're going to fold into us. I don't like that one organization taking control of everyone. I would prefer, honestly, if there were to be a vanguard, I'd prefer it to be a horizontal, non hierarchical vanguard of all of the different independent leftist organizations coming together. But that
Yeah.
is sort of a pipe dream.
So
It's we're both anarchists, and this comes at the problem of the anarchism and whether or not it's feasible.
yeah.
And I would say that both of us are on fairly similar ground, that we've seen experiments in systems of organization in the past. We see the systems of organization in front of us, and we say there is too much authority, there's too much power. The big guys are trampling on the little guys. How do we fix that? And we
Yeah.
have somewhat different ideas of how to fix that.
I agree with you there, and we're both anarchists, even though we have different, slightly different, at least, interpretations of how anarchy would look in practice and what constitutes genuine anarchy and what's the fake anarchy. I think I see. It seems to me that there's a bit of a contradiction that you're trying to resolve on your end, because you don't like state authority, you don't like vertical integration, and neither do I, and you want to see more horizontal. You want to see more power to the workers, to the little guy, which I also want to see. But I'm predicting that a turn away from authoritarianism is going to result in more opportunities for both worker-owned means of production as well as privately capitalist-owned means of production. You don't want to see the capitalist aspect instantiate itself, so you're trying to you're struggling to pick between like a state intervention against the capitalist class versus letting the state wither away and just rely on class consciousness and rely on the workers to get rid of the capitalist class. I don't see that happening in a stateless society, because the historical record and modern day right now shows that the places with less state intervention tend to have more private property rights, more competition, more instances of privately owned enterprises, more instances of wage labor and people working on things they don't own, and people owning things they don't work on. But definitely there is room for worker-owned co-ops. And those things are fine. They can be great. Sometimes people democratically make great decisions, not all the time. And sometimes people who are owning companies all by themselves make great decisions, not all the time. But I very strongly believe that in an anarchist society, you would have instances of both of these things happening, and whether or not the worker co-ops flourish or the private enterprises flourish is going to depend on which ones more adequately satisfy the wants of the consumers, and the consumer choice will be the determining factor. Consumer choice is going to be the determining factor in which one of those enterprises succeed and which ones fail.
All right, I kind of want us to wrap up. We've been going at this a good hot minute.
Yeah,
But
we sure have.
Forgot.
I think this one was good, man.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think we brought some fun drama.
Yeah, in my ideology, I'm trying to solve the conflict between how do we first create a worker controlled society, and then how do we maintain it. And the argument that when socialist states have appeared in the past, and then the youth kind of rebels against it and says, we're not going to take it, we want to be free, we want the free market, we're capitalists. I understand why the youth would say that we're capitalists and we're in favor of the free market. They see the
And the same thing happens in reverse in America. All the youth here are rebelling and saying we're socialists now. You see, the grass is always greener on the other side, right?
That the problem with those socialist countries is that those countries call themselves socialist, but I personally would not consider them to be socialist because all they do is they don't have worker control of the means of production. They have state control over the means of production. Yeah. And I have a very firm, like, I don't think that those are the same thing at all. And that if you grow up in a society where you're told, oh yeah, you live in a society where the workers control the means of production, but you live in a society where the state controls the means of production, naturally you're going to say, well, that's kind of bullshit. You say that the workers are in control, but they're not. I want a truly free market. I think that private people should be able to control, not have the state control everything. And it's sort of both sides wanting the little guy to have the power and not be screwed over by the big powerful bad guy. And it's that the right sees the state as being the big powerful bad guy, and the authoritarian left doesn't see the state as the big powerful bad guy. I mean, I kind of see the anarcho-communist stance as being the synthesis between anarchism and communism, that we see both the state and the corporations as like, oh no, they're both bad. We don't like either of them.
Okay, yeah. So, but I agree with you. Let's wrap it up. I want to ask you just one last question, then, real quick for fun. Do you, in light of all the stuff we've talked about, do you feel like the path to anarchy, if you have to do some kind of unity with another camp, do you feel like you're going to be more successful achieving anarchy if we do a bottom unity with the ANCAPs and the ANSINs? Or do you feel like you're going to more likely achieve anarchy if you do a left unity? What do you think?
Well, I am absolutely more in favor of bottom unity than left.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm a bottom unity fan myself.
Than left unity. And that I have honestly, I'm starting to see myself less as a syndicalist lately and more as a mutualist.
You mentioned that mutualism before.
I mentioned mutualism. Mutualism kind of seems like the absolute perfect synthesis of the free market and the labor theory of value. It is a free market based on the labor theory of value, that it is a free market of sole proprietorships and co-ops where it's based on use rights, that you get your property ownership is based on what you used. And I used to call myself a syndicalist. More and more I'm reading about mutualism, and I'm liking more as I read. And mutualism is just the synthesis of anarcho-communism and it's anarcho-capitalism. It kind of feels like it's solving all of the problems that all of them are facing.
Maybe it is. You know what? I've only read about mutualism a little bit here and there. I've tended to read more about the extreme right and the extreme left. But you know what? I am going to look up a little more about mutualism after this episode is done, because I think it's interesting, and what you've said about it so far I like the idea of the synthesis thing. So I'm going to check out mutualism afterwards. And that's all the homework for all the viewers too. Go read more about mutualism.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on.
It was my pleasure.
Have a fantastic day. I hope to have you on again. I hope to see you on Modern Day Debates. That'll be awesome for us there.
So yeah, I'm scheming to get on Modern Day Debates, and I want to go in with a good debate opponent, and I think you're that guy. I'm practicing to increase my power level, but I think sometime in the coming months we can get a spot on there. So if we come up with a good topic that the viewers will enjoy, that we can riff back and forth on, and we can bring in some sparks and drama, it'll be a lot of fun. But yeah, check out the Modern Day Debate. They do all kinds of debates. They're not just political, but there's been a lot of anarchist style debates on there that are a lot of fun, and I think we can contribute. So it would be great.
awesome. I look forward to it. I'm just hoping I don't pull you over to my side beforehand.
Oh crap! What happens if yeah? Because that would be a bummer. We're gonna have to make sure that
if we both end up as mutualists
Yeah.
before this, and it's like, well, we were on opposite sides.
I know, right? Well, see, in that case, if we both become mutualists before we get onto modern day debates, then what we do instead is we do a tag team where we'll have us as the mutualist camp versus two commies or something.
Are we gonna argue against Nazbuls?
Yeah, there we go. That would be great. Smash fascio communism. Yeah.
Oh my god, that would be funny. All right. Go get your kids lunch. I'm sorry to keep them waiting. Have a fantastic evening. I will catch you on the flip flop.
Thank you so much, man. It was a pleasure.
All right, bye.